source, where you're able. We're in the process of determining in what cases you're able to do that.
I noticed on your slide distribution you had no boxes that were shaded. Doesn't the RICE Act have anything to do with that?
Well, we're in this. I will comment on that. In this particular rulemaking, we are because we. First off, we're not regulating rice. It's reciprocating internal combustion engines is what RICE stands for. And these compressor stations have huge engines that drive the compressors. And we have recent rulemaking, and I can't remember exactly which ones are. We have two different. We have a NESHAP rule that's going on, and Penny would be glad to tell you about that.
Yeah, we actually put out a rule that both a new source performance standard as well as a new toxic standard for gas-fired engines in January of 2008. And we're also under a consent decree for this month to issue the rest of those standards, which will be the existing source toxic standards, or NESHAP, for the gas-fired engines.
Thanks.
My question is about your PowerPoint presentation. It was actually a pretty helpful guide to this whole area and to what this process involves. Is that available, or will you make that available?
We will have it posted this week to our website on the address that you have there in the handout.
I noticed in your presentation you talked about and you went over it kind of, I didn't quite understand it. What is the new rule change on the flash emissions? You said something like some are covered, which ones are covered, and you kind of mentioned major sources. So does that exclude site storage, water?
That's right, because we're talking, major sources is the only place that those the toxic rule covers those flash emissions from those tanks.
So what is a major source?
Major source is a source that emits at least 10 tons of one hazardous air pollutant, or combination of any hazardous air pollutant from 25 tons a year. I'm sorry, and area sources apply to all the ones that are not major. I'm sorry, I left that distinguished. I forgot to distinguish that.
I've got a follow-up to that. Are the rules, in these rules, are we considering lowering that number at all for what we consider a major source?
Oh, no, that's in the Clean Air Act in Section 112.
Okay, so there's no
flexibility there.
on the numbers.
Well, yeah. When we write the rules, we can both write rules for major sources and area sources, or small sources. So we can regulate the smaller sources as well. They're just in two different. They're treated separately.
And for the purpose of the audience here tonight, who may not be familiar with what area source is, demarking it from major, could you please?
Everything is not a major source.
Okay. It's just everything that falls below that.
Right.
Okay.
Now, I will like to clarify, we're talking about regulating area sources. There is a provision in the Clean Air Act under Section 112, it's 112N4, that prohibits us from listing areas, wells as area sources, unless we do a risk determination to show that it's a non-negligible risk in metropolitan statistical areas of 1 million or more. And we're also in the same provision of the Clean Air Act, it also prohibits us from putting these together to make a major source out of them.
I think you just answered my question, because one of the questions I've been having and thinking about is we're talking about storage tanks with such and such volume, so many barrels, and I've been wondering what would keep a company then from switching to several smaller tanks to avoid the rules. Are y'all addressing that?
There's really nothing that would keep them from going to smaller tanks, except it may not be economically feasible for them to do a lot of this. The other thing is that because we didn't talk about this in the presentation, but you have thresholds, major source and area source we're talking about for the toxics rule, but for NSPS there's no lower threshold that must be met. And so that gives us more flexibility if we go out and look at using NSPS to get at the new sources that might have lower emissions than we would be able to get at with the toxics rule.
We really need to be able to close that door when it comes to the storage tanks so that we are covering vapor recovery systems on all of them, 100% there.
Well, there are some, I don't want to debate it, but I just want to let you know there are some drawbacks, not drawbacks, but there are some constraints with regard to VRUs, or vapor recovery units.
Thank you so much.
But appreciate it.
Yes, I was wondering if you could explain to me a little better about these compressor stations. What's considered, around me they consider a lot of them to be called all gathering stations. And then you have the bigger facilities evidently that put the gas to Chicago, New York, and those people seem to be protected with those type of compressors, but a gathering station, I'd really like to just know the definition of what is its job, because our gathering stations clean the gas, they put it in a bigger pipeline, they ship it into Oklahoma, and are considered gathering stations. So I'd just like to have a better definition of what the
Well,
are.
a gathering station normally would take gas from individual wells and put it together, pump it to a processing plant. So that's generally what we're talking about. And they use smaller compressors there. And so the smaller compressors would probably not fall subject to the DSHAP or the toxics rule because of one of two things. If they have an annual emissions of benzene of less than 1 ton, then they're out of the rule. Now, that excludes them.
I don't know what your idea of a small compressor station is when you start stacking 3, 4, 5, 6 of these things in a row and they're considered individuals. I don't see how that's going to work on your guys' whole emissions thing here. They got to be considered as one unit if they're stacked together like that, and they're still considered gathering stations.
But I'll bet you that, I'm just guessing, I'm not trying to take a position here, I'm just trying to think. I have a feeling that the benzene emissions, if they have dehydrators there, and that's the only thing that would be subject to our toxics rule really, would be the emissions would probably be less than the 1 ton per year of benzene. If they have a dehy there, and if they're a major source as well.
You think this is something that the EPA should be looking at though? All these, there's 130 of these scattered around where I live, and I live in the mountains. I'm from Arkansas. They're just scattered all over us. We're talking, what are they, 1,400 horsepower or 14,000 RPM machines with no noise abatements, no catalytic converters on them or anything. They just blow straight raw natural gas into the air after they burn it.
They can be regulated in 2 different ways that Bruce was talking about. One is under the new source performance standard, they can be covered so that either existing ones or as they're changed or modified, they get covered. And that would be, though, for the nitrogen oxide emissions or PM emissions or CO emissions or carbon monoxide. Or they also, in places like Dallas, where it's a non-attainment area for ozone, they can also be regulated both with control technique guidelines or under state rules to reduce their emissions in order to achieve the standards. And there has been compressor stations that I'm aware of in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that have put on controls for the purposes of trying to bring down their ozone levels. And that has happened in other areas as well.
Another thing would be CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations. What are them things and how do they work?
Well, that's where the rules are made official. And then after we publish and finalize the rule in the Federal Register, then it's put in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that is the actual rule. That's the regulation.
That is the rule. So the Arkansas has to follow those rules or no?
Yes.
Right.
When we do a national rule, they apply to all areas of the country.
Wow, because they tell me they don't
The new source performance standards and the MAC standards apply to all areas of the country.
So the whole CFR book, even on the noise pollution coming off these things, everything has to...
Noise is not regulated under the Clean Air Act.
It is a pollutant and it's coming off of the gas drilling.
It is considered by a number of people as a definite concern, but it is not. We do not have legal authority to reduce noise.
Even though it's a CFR.
No, we don't have a federal rule to reduce noise.
I think I got a CFR print here with me that's on noise.
I'm unaware of any federal EPA standards dealing with noise.
I'll turn that in a little later.
Yeah, I'd be happy to look at it.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, gentlemen. Esther McElfish, North Central Texas Community Alliance. Nice to see you all. I think people are more confused now after you gave that information than they were before. Am I wrong? You got to keep this down to a real simple level. I mean, even for those of us that are involved in this, I think that it's like way over there. And mainly, we're here because in the Metroplex, even though you're talking about populations of 1 million or over, that's a no-brainer. We're already there. What we're concerned is a cumulative effect. And you were talking specifically about some of the 10 tons, 25 tons, and so forth. I think you really need to simplify this for folks so that we can understand the rules. We gave some basic examples. I think most people that are here tonight are going to be talking in terms of, you know, individual tanks, compressor stations, just like the gentleman was saying. When you've got 4 in a row or more, and there are people in this room that have seen that in their neighborhoods, we're talking cumulative effects from the equipment, from the pipelines, from the drilling operations. Now, I don't know if that falls within your guidelines of what is on the books now. If it's not, that's what we need to know as citizens so we can help if that's changed. The other thing is that I think a lot of people want to understand how this plays in with the TCEQ and our favorite agency. And so we'd like to see how those regulations can impact what's going on right now with the SIP and with the TCEQ and their enactment, because we all know they're up for sunset review in January, and if there's something we can do to help you strengthen these rules, we'd certainly like to.
I think if I could just try one thing, I think what Bruce was walking through was that this is at least as far as the confusion factor is concerned. We have 2 sets of rules that are on the books right now. One deal with hazard servers and one of these new source performance standards. Those are tools that are available to us, and that's all. I think that's the best way to think about it. Those are regulatory tools that we can use, and we are using them together. We're looking at this sector in a holistic way, and the issues, the regulatory things that Bruce laid out, control technique guidelines, new source performance standards, and hazard reserve rules are tools that we have, and we're going to be looking at this industry with all of those in mind. At the same time, he was also just trying to show that the rules that are on the books right now are only covering portions of the entire process. And so we're going to be looking at the entire process. So I think the other point that he was trying to make was that everything is on, we're not just looking at the narrow rules that we have and just focusing on those. We're going to be looking at all the emission sources in the sector. That's the key point that I think we need. Major source definition and all of that. I mean, we could spend, you know, the rest of the evening talking about that, and it is confusing, and it's not necessarily relevant. It'd be very relevant. That's when we develop the rules. But just think of those as tools that we have, and we'll probably come out with the new source performance standard rule if we